Okay, back here to talk more about violentization theory using Lonnie Athens' approach. This is the second video in the series. Now, what we needed to do was to go back and try to discover or use indicators from violentization theory and try to discover if they fit what was actually happening in the Abu Ghraib prison. And so, with brutalization, some of the indicators would be witnessing violence, coaching others how to engage in violence, being told that one has a personal responsibility to use violence, threatening others with force, for example. And then the next stage, defiance, being in situations where violent behavior is encouraged or appropriate, and believing that one must kill or be killed, or one must harm others or they will be harmed. And then the violent dominant engagement stage, looking at some of the indicators, engaging in violent acts to test out the result. And groups are directed to carry out violence. Uh, and a lot of that has to do with the teachings and socialization process that occurs in the previous two stages. The virulency, the fourth stage, looks at the belief system that the group or individual are dangerous and violent. And so here we have self-definitions and also receiving support for violent actions. Well, if you think about the Abu Ghraib situation, according to a lot of the records, there were reports that first of all, you had people working as correctional officers who had no training. You had some basically kid in there. I think some 18-year-old right out of high school had a couple, out of basic training, ends up there and expect to, work with, in a war zone prison with detainees is irresponsible all across the board. How you have that person there is beyond me. That person who I'm thinking about was one of the young women who was eventually charged and convicted of crimes from that and spent some time in a military prison. But my real question is, what was she doing there in the first place? And so the training, what training did some of the other people, the young people that were caught up in that situation? And then what about, were there leaders, and were those leaders violentized by those even above them? Were they really told to soften up the prisoners by using a variety of techniques? So there's a lot of arguments and debates about this. I think what's pretty clear is that the virulency stage was reached and it went into extreme virulency, where you had torture, you had sexual violence, you had sadomasochistic behavior. And not only did we have, testimony of that occurring, but we had pictures, pictures of it and video. That says something right there, that people would take pictures of this for whatever reason and then share it with others. Almost seems as if they weren't even recognizing how terribly illegal their behavior was. That, and that's part of the violentization process in that sense. I don't think they realized, the magnitude of what they were doing. And Lonnie Athens talks about different communities. What you'd have in this situation is called a malignant minor community, which is basically a community where chaos predominates and ultra-violent behavior is the norm. And that's what you have in that situation, at least in Abu Ghraib. Or ultra-violent behavior may occur. Well, in this situation, it certainly did. And so, back to the bad apples, rotten barrel, I'm not interested in that still. What I'm interested in, how did they become violentized? We can go back and we can look at, some of the case reports, the media reports. I used several government documents that are cited in the study that looked at, the investigation. I don't believe that we have access to the actual trials, which would be interesting to take a look at. I mean, we know sort of the outcome, but I don't know if they allow, cameras in these military hearings that are going to be on, the major news stations. I'm not aware of that being, part of a, something that's distributed. I'm guessing they're probably closed and not distributed. But if you know where there's the transcripts from the trial, let me know and I'll add those to future studies. We used a method called directed qualitative content analysis where we coded the themes and patterns that we saw in the data, which basically were the investigatory reports by some of the military investigators. What we found is that the Abu Ghraib torture situation was consistent with the violentization process, basically. And building on Milgram's and Gibson's work, we basically saw that this process was learned, and there's already a predisposition for obedience and binding the group together because of the nature of where they were. Basically, they were in a prison. And they weren't going anywhere. They were in a prison. They were, so-called correctional officers in a prison, but they didn't go home at night or during the morning, or they didn't have, if they had shifts, they still were in the prison. They still were getting bombed. They still were getting shot at. They still were seeing riots. They still didn't have the tools they needed. They still didn't have the support they needed. So you don't have, they're looking for strain reduction that Milgram and Gibson talk about. Part of that may have become, the torture situations they engaged in. If people told them to do this and they didn't come up on it on their own, they probably would have obeyed. They would have thought, well, that's part of the process, especially some 18-year-old person who has no training in this. So I highly recommend that you take a look at some of those YouTube videos that document this whole case. I warn you in advance, some of them, while excellent productions, are very graphic and show nudity and show torture and show sexual sadistic behavior. So we have that predisposition. Also, predisposition for obedience. Also, we see coaching and reinforcing of torture behaviors. And this seems to even bind the small group even tighter as a stress strain reduction mechanisms. In other words, the torture was supportive. You have one of the lower level soldiers, smiling and posing with these detainees that are being tortured and putting and giving the thumbs up sign and so on. You have another person. There's a famous photograph where he's painted his face in a very I think it would be scary way to humiliate and induce fear into the prisoners. So we have that strain reduction factor. Zimbardo, and you can read Zimbardo's work. Zimbardo, if you took Intro to Psychology, you remember the Stanford prison experiments. That's Zimbardo. Dr. Zimbardo has been studying, obedience and torture and the whole social psychology for many, many, many years, and is considered one of the, experts in the field. And he points out in his 2007 book that these individuals may have started their careers as well-adjusted, law-abiding, citizens. But, and as Gibson points out in the article that we cite in our paper, that they develop their own rituals, rites, and language. And we believe this was part of that violentization process. Zimbardo points out how the chaotic environment of Abu Ghraib and the removal of the external supervision and constraints on whatever type of deviant behavior occurred was very, easy to ascertain because there was encouragement by others to soften up the detainees. Zimbardo says this photography of the torture, especially the sexual violence, was of an exhibitionistic nature as well. So there's a whole process that we see going on here. And then bringing in Becker's work, Becker, the anthropologist, his 1975 work, Escape from Evil, points out some things I think are relevant to apply as well. For example, scapegoating, that, these prisoners were scapegoated in a variety of ways, and they were viewed by those that tortured them as very evil. And that by defining them and scapegoating them in certain ways, that they're able to bring their group closer together. And as Becker points out, a group may create evil in order to destroy it for self-esteem enhancing purposes. And Becker says this is all related to the human fear of death. And certainly, if you look at the Abu Ghraib situation, I think everyone who was there, whether they were prisoner or whether they were, working there, in a sense, they still would be prisoner in, the social psychology of it, that everyone probably had this fear of death. It was a reality. And bringing in Lifton's work on doubling, and doubling is this process that Professor Lifton pointed out, is the division of the self into two really separate functioning wholes. And I'm not saying split personality, or dissociation or something like that. No, what we're saying here is that there was, the Abu Ghraib self and their other self. And so this is another methodology we could use to begin to look at how they were able to do this, and then how they're able to go back and function in outside of Abu Ghraib. So a lot of questions there as well. And I'm going to wrap up this video and then have a very, very brief summary on the third one.